as an introduction, but now, Jean-Yves, you may argue. So I would say that you represent not computer science of cognition, but the kind of the nature, the background of cognition, right? So it's just trying to make science of cognition, not just computer science, yeah. And the basis you should explain. I don't want to say exactly, just it is your title. And I was looking at your work for many years, yeah, for about 12 years now, maybe one, even more, 14 years, when I first encountered this work, and was very fascinated by the ideas of how you switch your attention from technical performance to the basis, to more fundamental level, what motivates performance and cognition, and what drives it on the bottom of things. And this is what you have been doing in real terms, yeah, not theoretically. And that's, I think, is enough. Then the rest you can say, yeah. And I'm still, of course, very, very curious to know what was the progress, because for the last 5-6 years I haven't followed your papers. So you'll tell.
Okay, thanks a lot, Misha, for the introduction. So let me share my screen. Okay. Do you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. You see the slide on the full screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. That's a real pleasure to discuss with you today. I'm going to talk about a domain that with a number of colleagues we've been trying to build over the years, and we call developmental artificial intelligence, which we might summarize as an approach where we try to build machines that learn like children or learn like aspects of child learning mechanisms. And in particular, today I will emphasize two concepts. I will introduce the notion of autotelly learning, and I'll explain what it means. And I also discuss how social environments plays an important role in shaping intelligence. As a start, just a few comments on recent progress in machine learning and AI, and the kind of progress that many of us have heard in the news, progress that are impressive. So for example, we've seen and now a few years ago, systems like AlphaGo learning to play the game of Go and become better than the best human players, which was thought to be kind of impossible 10 years ago. And recent methods of deep reinforcement learning combined with a lot of compute power enabled to go over this challenge. And more recently, such deep reinforcement learning systems were also applied in the real world. So to say, like, for example, to control robots over challenging terrain and enabling robust locomotion, or, for example, enabling autonomous guidance of balloons. Here, there's a photograph of a balloon that is autonomously roaming in the skies of Africa, and that's a balloon that enables to distribute internet to faraway populations. And there is a difficult control problems to economize energy, and deep reinforcement learning systems were shown to be quite efficient at this. And there was also recently a number of uses of those techniques to discover, for example, how to build new molecules, for example, in the domain of medicine, and it enabled to do things we could not do before. So that's very, very impressive, but there are also a number of pretty fundamental limits, both in the techniques and also in the approach. So maybe just what's behind this approach? Basically, what people do when they try to do this is that they consider large neural networks, which typically are called policies. So basically, they take as input the current state, and they produce as output what's the next action that should be done, such that if you repeat that many times in the long term, you will maximize an external reward. And so there is an engineer typically who needs to define by hand an optimization objective, defining the task. So for example, in the game of Go, it's like implementing the like something that understands the rules of Go and decides when someone is winning or not. Or in the case of robotic navigation, you have a program that needs to define when walking is supposed to be good or bad. So which means, for example, measuring how the speed forward advances and how much energy is spent. So you need the engineer to program the task by programming this reward function, this optimization objective. And then most of the research community focuses on trying to understand what kind of neural network. So basically a neural network is a black box function parameterized by hundreds of millions of parameters. Sometimes it's billions of parameters. And so the challenge is to define the right architecture of those neural networks, and also, and maybe more importantly, to find the efficient optimization algorithms that are going to optimize those billions of parameters given data collected by interacting with the environment. And so most of the research frame like this is really technically focused on basically how to design new optimization algorithms that are efficient to optimize billions of parameters. But what is very characteristic also of those approaches is that the engineer is still very present. Like for every new task, the human engineer needs basically to define and program a new reward function. And very often also the engineer needs to tune a number of things in the neural network to adapt it to a new task. So that's very, very different from child learning and development. So children are extraordinary learners, not so much because some of them become world champions in the game of Go, or maybe because they go very far away in mathematics. They are really extraordinary because most of them, nearly all of them, acquire efficiently a wide diversity of everyday skills ranging from locomotion, building Lego structures, riding bicycles, mastering language, of course. And what's really different from the other kind of machines I just presenting is that learning is autonomous. So here there is never an engineer that opens the brain and makes some tunings for every new task. It's also developmental in the sense that learning happens in a specific ordering with a specific timing. So for example, children don't first begin by trying to learn advanced mathematics. First of all, they learn how to control their bodies, and even by controlling their bodies, they don't first try to learn on their two legs. They first learn how to control their gaze, to go from belly to the back, then to walk on four legs, etc. So it's very, very progressive. And a fundamental question is how such developmental sequences form and what's their role? What's the role of these developmental structures? And probably such developmental pathways, which we can view as learning curriculum, they are useful to address a fundamental problem, which is how to guide learning of so many things with so limited resources in time, in computation, and in energy. So why I also insist on this limitation of time and energy is that this is also in contrast with the machine learning approaches I presented just before. So for example, to train a system that becomes better than the best human players at the game of Go, those systems needed to train themselves on a number of games that is much larger than the number of games that the whole humanity has played so far. So the number of data that was needed to do that was really huge as compared to, and also that was made possible because thanks to very large computational resources, it was possible to run in parallel hundreds of thousands of gameplays. So you can kind of parallelize the world in a sense to explore it and get a lot of data. Of course, a human child, he cannot do that. He lives physically in the world and he has only one life. He cannot explore parallel universes, many of them to get a lot of data. And so he needs to be very efficient in terms of collecting and using the data. And so basically we try to study and to model aspects of child development along 3 dimensions. So first, like we build algorithmic models that we aim to help understanding of better human development. So here we collaborate a lot with developmental psychology and neuroscience. Then we study how those insights might help us build lifelong autonomous learning machines. And finally, we study how these insights can also find application in various domains. I will illustrate two of those domains today. One is educational technologies, and another one is assisted discovery in physics or biology, for example. And all those works that we've been doing, they are basically organized around three fundamental ideas that I try to describe today. There is one first fundamental idea is that the child is autotellic. So what does it mean? It means that children can be viewed as like curious little scientists that generate their own goals, their own objectives. They're intrinsically motivated to spontaneously explore the world. And that's very different from the kinds of machines that I was presenting at the beginning, where their goals and their objectives are imposed by a human engineer. Another fundamental idea, I will discuss it much less today, but still it's pretty important, is that intelligence is embodied and develops through multiple kinds of self-organization processes. And basically what it gets to is that it leverages a lot some properties of the physical world. So basically, intelligence is not only in the neurons, if we could summarize. And finally, another fundamental idea is that intelligence developed in a social context. And basically, this has several dimensions. So first of all, it's like the idea that social peers scaffold learning, help to guide learning. But there is also another dimension, which I'll explain, which is that language and culture progressively become internalized in the cognitive system and become cognitive tools even for non-social and non-language tasks. Okay, so let's begin by the first idea. So that's an idea that's been defended in psychology by many, but maybe, for example, two of the big names exploring this idea were Piaget and Berlin. Okay, so one really amazing property of child development is that the children spend a lot of time spontaneously exploring their environment. And they're not doing it because someone asked them to explore and to solve a given task. Rather, they are driven by what psychologists have called intrinsic motivations, or something that in everyday language we may call curiosity. And so during exploratory play, they basically invent and they pursue their own problems, their own objectives. And this kind of spontaneous exploration has been argued to be key in child development, in particular for learning general world models, general knowledge, general skills that can be reused later on when they have to solve a specific problem that is imposed to them. So a number of teams in the world, including mine, have been working now for a while on modeling the aspects of those capabilities and transfer them in AI system. And I'm going to illustrate that. So psychologists actually began to discuss the idea of intrinsic motivation or curiosity-driven learning system already in the 40s and 50s in the last century. And they were speaking, they were hypothesizing that the brain may contain some motivational circuits that pushed infants to be intrinsically interesting by things like novelty, surprise, cognitive dissonance, intermediate novelty, optimal challenge. So they were like playing with many kinds of related concept, but the limit of this line of work has been that actually these hypotheses have remained relatively vague at the verbal level, and there was not so much from a long time an operational study of this concept from an operational perspective. What could be the mechanisms behind those concepts? So things have changed a lot in the recent years. A few labs in the world began to try to study really those mechanisms, and in particular with a collaboration between AI lab, psychology lab, neuroscience lab, and now there is really an interdisciplinary community in the world. Here I'm showing a number of colleagues I've been working with, and we've been trying to build a theoretical framework to think about those questions. And so this theoretical perspective has been basically to see the child as a sense-making organism, like a little scientist that makes experiments to acquire good predictive models of the world. And I would say even more importantly, good models that enable control of the world with their actions. And okay, most research in psychology, but also in machine learning, has so far focused on understanding what kind of mechanisms enable efficient learning, assuming you provide the data and assuming you provide a task to a child or to a machine. So that was basically the kind of machine learning approaches I presented in my first slides. So in my first slides, when I presented the AlphaGo, the robots learning to walk, basically it was assuming that the engineer provides a task and very often also provides a data set to learn from. But a fundamental question that's often overlooked is how an autonomous learner can decide for itself what tasks to learn, when and in what order to learn them, and how to represent those novel tasks as new discoveries are made. And that's basically this metacognitive learning architecture that now I'm just showing, which basically involves constructing what we might call a meta model, which is a model of where the model of the world is good or bad, depending on interaction with the world. That's also measuring like computing measures of interestingness, what could be interesting to explore, what kind of problems or goals could be interesting to explore. And then that contains some forms of a meta decision model which is about deciding, okay, now what goal or what problem or what experiment I'm going to focus on. And then once it's decided, there is the low-level, more classical learning loop that goes on through interacting with the environment and progressively updating the world models. Okay, so more concretely, and so yeah, what's very important is that the process of doing that loop and iteratively learning to represent, to generate, to sample, and to pursue one's own goal, it's really what we call autotellic learning. Okay, but more precisely, how does autotellic learning work? So here is the default algorithmic structure that's common to many of the systems we've been working on, and we call that framework IMJEP. It means intrinsically motivated goal exploration processes. And so in those processes, there is a first step of the loop where the agent basically observes the context in which it is, and he samples the goal with an internal machine, which is called the goal generator. So that's basically representing a space of goals associated with a mechanism to sample in that space of goals. Then it's going to generate appropriate actions to try to achieve that goal, given another machine in its brain, which is what we call a goal condition policy. So you can see that as a big neural network that takes as input the current context, but also a representation of the goal, and that's going to decide what's the sequence of actions that might be useful to achieve that goal. So initially, the agent is going to be pretty bad at that, but it's going to learn. It's going to learn by actually using another mechanism in his own brain, which is also a way to score its achievement to its self-generated goals, and that's what we call a goal condition reward function. So that's another neural network which takes as input a goal, a state, and a trajectory of behavior generated by the policy and gives a score. And this can be simple, this can be more or less complicated, this can be actually also learned. I'll give example of how it can be learned at the end of this talk. And then sometimes the goal, for example, he has set at the beginning, sometimes he manages to reach it, and so he's reinforcing its policy to be even more efficient in the future, but sometimes also he fails. But even if it fails, most of the time he can learn. So for example, maybe imagine a robot that imagine the goal of pushing a box on the right. It tries some action and actually he failed to push it on the right, but then actually in practice, he pushed it on the left. And so by a mechanism that we call hindsight learning, he could say, okay, if my goal would have been to push on the left, now I would have been succeeding, and I can learn from this new data about this goal that I imagine a posteriori. And so basically, this kind of hindsight learning is very efficient and useful for learning. Okay, so now let me illustrate in more detail some aspects of this kind of mechanisms. And the first aspect I'd like to illustrate is the the goal sampling mechanisms and how it can enable to organize, to self-organize the learning curriculum. So in this first part, I'll first consider that, assume that there is some kind of already existing goal space representations that typically hand defined by the experimenter in that case. Later on, we'll see how it could be learned. And I also assume that the goal achievement function is known to the agent. So it's just the problem of how to sample the goals and how to order them. And so this basically boils down to the question, what's an interesting goal or what's an interesting learning experiment for a little scientist, if you want so. But there are many hypotheses that were considered and studied in the literature, actually both in the psychology literature, in the neuroscience literature, but also in AI and in machine learning. A first kind of naive idea would be to say that what's interesting is to explore problems or parts of the environments where you make a lot of prediction errors, where you have a lot of uncertainty, for example. But if you do that, you'll actually see that if you program this in a robot, for example, it will lead to very problematic behavior. So for example, you might see a robot that spends its whole day staring through a window and trying to make some kind of strange movements. And if you open the brain and try to see what it's doing, actually it might be trying to explore the relation between how its movement might predict or change the color of the cars or the color of the shirts of the people going behind the window, which is of course completely uncorrelated. And so there is no way you can predict that well. But if you ask the robot, okay, go explore part of the world where you're pretty bad at predicting, it's what it's going to do, because there are many parts of the world which is very complex, which are unpredictable and uncontrollable. So of course you want to do something that's smarter than this. So actually there are other approaches that can actually solve part of this problem. Actually, I forgot to write them on that slide. And these are approaches that actually try to measure what's called epistemic uncertainties, which means that under certain assumptions, there are a number of approaches that can distinguish between uncertainty due to lack of knowledge and uncertainty due to intrinsic randomness in the environment. And in that case, those approaches, they might be used to say, okay, I want you to explore uncertainty in the case where it's due to a lack of knowledge, and you try to avoid uncertainty that's due to intrinsic randomness. And in that case, there are a number of approaches that could discover that trying to predict the color of cars passing by, very quickly you understand that it's just an inherent stochastic process, and you learn the mean, you learn the distribution, but there is nothing more to learn, and you shift to something else. But still, actually, even if you're able to characterize where in the world you have epistemic uncertainty, where you lack a lot of knowledge, if you push a machine or an agent to explore where it lacks a lot of knowledge, it will also actually be problematic. Why is this so? It's because basically in the real world, there are many things that can in principle be learned, but during the lifetime, which is very short, you don't have time to learn everything. And if you tell to the agent, focus where you have most epistemic uncertainty, where your knowledge is most lacking, for example, it will right from the beginning start by trying to focus on the most difficult learnable problem. So it's a bit like you have a little baby, and basically you would decide, okay, where I like most knowledge about is, I don't know, advanced mathematics. I don't care about learning how to walk, how to grasp objects. I lack much more knowledge in, I don't know, differential equations. And of course, if the baby tries his efforts directly trying to learn differential equation, it will be very hard. He might not make progress. He might spend his whole life trying to learn it without success and never learning anything else. And this is not really what you want. So given that the world is too vast, there is too many things learnable so that basically you want another mechanism that instead of focusing on very complicated learnable knowledge, you want to focus rather on learnable knowledge that's just beyond what you already know. Not too easy, not too complicated. And so one approach that we've been considering to do that is actually by considering that maybe what's interesting are problems or goals for which the derivative of your knowledge or the derivative of your performance is maximal. And so that's what we've been calling the learning progress hypothesis. So imagine, for example, an idealized environment, and maybe you have 4 kinds of problems you can focus on. And imagine that you would have time to explore each of them. There would be problem, for example, represented by the blue curve here, and that's a problem that initially you're very good at, very few errors, and it keeps very low error. And there are 3 other problems that initially, when you explore, you play with them, you are pretty bad, you do a lot of errors, but as you invest more time in them, you'll discover that there are 2 of them in which you make progress, but with different rates. And there is one of them which you just don't any progress at all. And so the basic idea is that the learning progress hypothesis basically say that what you should look at to decide where you use your time on is to go for the activity where your derivative is maximal. So initially in the real world, you don't really know in advance the shape of those learning curves. So you need to sample them initially to explore and to make a model of their derivative if you want. And then after you begin to discover there is one of them that's a bit more promising in terms of progress, you focus on them. So that's here the black curve. And so you're exploring a little bit more. And at some point you reach a plateau. And at this point, you discover that maybe the one with the highest learning progress is the green one. And so you shift automatically to it while avoiding to spend too much time on activities like 1, which is impossible to learn, or 4, which is trivial and there is no learning progress to do. So that's the basic idea. And as you see, in principle, it generates some forms of organization of the learning curriculum. That's not programmed in advance. It's really like self-organized. And the last detail that's important is that actually I said that what's interesting is the derivative, but actually what's important is the absolute value of the derivative, the progress. And why is it important? I'm going to show it in 2 slides. Is that sometimes for some reasons a problem, an activity that you've learned and you became good in it, you can for some reason decrease your performances in that activity, maybe because aspects of this activity have changed, or maybe because you've forgotten part of it, and so you need to refocus on them. If you take the absolute value, it's going to help you detect that it's interesting again. So let's see a little bit more experimentally in what kind of environments we can test this idea. So here is a simulated robot environment on the top left. You have a simulated robotic arm with a number of objects around. So these are basically cubes. And basically here we give to the robot the language, a formal language enabling to generate and to formulate goals. So this formal language is pretty simple. It's the kind of goals it can imagine it, for example, reach object number 1, push object number 3, stack object 5 on top of object 6. So you have a list of such goals. And what we do is that in these environments, there are a number of controllable objects like classical cubes, but there are also a number of cubes which we program as little creatures that are moving on their own. And so basically this robot actually cannot predict their movements. It's too complicated to grasp them. And even if it grabs them, it's going to move away in some other place. So these are basically what we call distractors, randomly moving uncontrollable objects. But this robot does not know in advance that some of the objects and some of the tasks with objects are learnable and some others are not learnable. And so the way it's going to learn is again by the same general approach, where you have some form of neural network, which is basically a function parameterized by many parameters we call the weights, and it takes as inputs the state and an encoding of the goal, and it's basically outputting what's the optimal action to do to maximize the score for achieving a given goal. And there are a number of algorithms for optimizing those weights to maximize the score given a goal. But here, let's rather focus on the dynamics of how to explore the environment. Okay, so here, typically, again, if you explore the environment, by, for example, selecting goals where you do a lot of prediction errors, you will focus on the distractors and you will learn nothing. If you sample goals randomly, you will also spend a lot of your time focusing on the impossible goals, and you will actually also spend a lot of time on goals that are very easy, so not very, very efficient. And so basically what you need to do is find in that space of goal which kind of ones produce progress and which kind do not, which is going to allow for some form of automatic curriculum learning. So there are a few technical difficulties, like how to estimate efficiently the derivative and how to find efficiently the niches of learning progress. But here I'd like to focus more on the dynamics of exploration. And so typically what we observe is that, okay, so here we have a curve on the right showing the evolution of performances of the agent for various kinds of tasks. And here you see actually those curves here that go up. These are learnable tasks that are actually estimates from the perspective of the robot. He is doing his own estimation of his own competence on the task he is selecting. And here on the bottom, you see one line which is actually clustering several unlearnable tasks. And so the competence remains very, very slow. And so basically you have a system that's estimating and smoothing the derivative of those curves over time. And as you see, they have different profiles. You see that there is some kinds of bumps of derivative with time. And actually those derivatives are going to be used as a mechanism for sampling those different kinds of tasks, basically sampling them with a probability that's proportional to their learning progress and keeping a small percentage of exploration that's really random to just not be stuck in local minima. And what's interesting is that such a mechanism not only allows to go from simple to more complex, which is useful in an environment where you would have really hundreds of those tasks. Some of them would take much longer than the lifetime. It ensures that you are going to learn to use well the time in the lifetime, learning what's possible to learn given the time limitations. But also that's going to be very useful to deal with things like catastrophic forgetting. So one of the properties, bad properties of using neural networks for learning is that there can be what's called catastrophic forgetting or interference, in the sense that, for example, if you begin learning the weights of a neural network by focusing on a given goal, maybe at some point you learn when that goal, but when now you shift and you focus on other kinds of tasks, as knowledge is distributed across the weights, the parameters of the neural network, maybe learning a new task will cause interference with the weights that were learned from the previous task, and sometimes it can be catastrophic and some previous tasks can be learned. And so this is, for example, what happens in this experiment. So first you have the type of task that's blue, that's learned well, then the red and the green, and then because it's learned well, then now it goes to learn the orange kind of task, but still the agent is regularly continue to test itself on the other task, and it discovers it's becoming now bad at this task it was good before. And so he actually detects, thanks to using the absolute value, that now it's interesting again, and then he refocuses again on that task, and it enables to catch up and now to acquire those different tasks. Okay, so now if we look at how to apply that in real robot, that's actually possible. Here is an experiment where we've basically used very, very similar algorithms than the one I just described. And so the difference is that here we have a real physical robot and an environment that's a bit more complicated. Initially, what we provide to this machine is a set of motor primitives. The motor primitives are basically a set of differential equations with parameters that are going to control movements of the motors. And we give them also perceptual primitives that are going to enable him to detect where various kinds of objects are in the environment, to track their position, to track their colors, to track their sounds. And we give a language to this robot and enables it to represent and to sample goals. And typically goals here are going to be trajectories of those objects in the space of positions or in the space of sound or colors. Initially, the robot does not really know which objects are controllable or learnable. It does not even know what's the difference between parts of his body and other parts. So, for example, his hand is just one object among others in the environment. But by exploring the goals, initially he discovered that one of them initially produces more learning progress, and this is the hand. So he's focusing on trying to control the hand. And then after a while, he discovers that actually some other objects are enabled to produce learning progress, like those joysticks. So now he's focusing on those joysticks. And actually, one of them happens to do nothing, and the other one happens to control the little white electric toy in front of it. And so now we discover that the white electric toy is actually learnable and controllable, and is learning, setting goals, moving it in various ways. And now later on, he's actually focusing on moving the ball and setting goals, discovering fun things like this one, which is like basically hiding the ball, making it disappear. And at the same time, there are other objects in the environment which are too far away to be controlled, or there are also moving distractors, which he avoids to learn. And so just in a few hours, basically this robot learns to control complicated tools, like learning a joystick, to control an electric toy, to move a ball. So that's kind of nested tool use. Even though we did not ask this robot to specifically focus on that goal, so he's running an open repertoire. So that's kind of interesting. And by the way, if you do an experiment with this robot and you impose the specific task of moving the ball, it will actually not be able to learn in a reasonable time, because if you impose only to focus on that goal, basically it will not find ways to get a little bit of reward and to improve. Okay, so in the experiments I showed so far, I said that the goal space was basically already provided to the agent at the beginning. So I said, for example, the engineer gives a formal language enabling the machine to generate goals. But what about learning goal representations from scratch? And so this is what various teams, including mine, have been trying. And there are simple ways you can do that. So one way is, for example, initially the robot just perceives the world through its camera, so it's a matrix of pixels, and he's going to observe things moving around. And what he can do is that he can use some families of neural networks, like variational autoencoders, which are basically neural networks that learn to compress images into a low-dimensional code, such that, for example, this low-dimensional code can enable to decompress and reconstruct the image, or there are other ways to learn a useful compressed code. And this compressed code, if this kind of neural network is set up well, can, for example, come to represent objects, their position and their colors, and then goals the agent can generate can basically become the goal space become that latent space. And so they might say, okay, I'd like to reach a world configuration where this and this latent value, maybe corresponding to the position of an object, have this value, for example. And so in that case, those robots basically learn their own goal representations, though it is pretty concrete. And later on in the tutorial, I will explain how it can learn also goal representation that are much more abstract. Okay, so I'll be a little more quick in the follow-up because I see time is running. But in the experiment I just presented, actually, I explored the theoretical hypothesis of how to organize exploration that I tested for in machines. It showed how the learning progress hypothesis and the idea of autotellic learning, like selecting one's own goal, is very powerful, can enable robust learning without too much intervention with an engineer. But I mean, can it allow us to model aspects of human developmental trajectories? And so we've explored this question in various experiments. I won't enter into the detail, but I just give you a flavor. So for example, instead of constructing a robot like in the previous slides, we've been considering modeling vocal development, where we consider a realistic model of the vocal tract, of sound perception, and a model of the ear for sound perception. And we've studied how basically using this approach of curiosity-driven learning enables to reproduce aspects of the properties of vocal development we observe in children. We've also added in this environment some simulated social peers that are producing their vocalizations, an existing system of vocalization, and the curiosity-driven agent exploring the vocalization can either set its own goals or try to imitate some of the vocalizations of the environments, again, by using a measure of learning progress to decide whether it tries to target its like goals he imagines or sounds he's hearing in the environment. And so what we could observe is that by this process, we see emergent developmental stages, for example, transition from no phonation to exploring unarticulated sounds, to exploring articulated sounds like canonical babbling, ba, 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 ma, ma, ma. That's completely self-organized out of the system I described. And this is something we observe in children. It doesn't need to be pre-programmed. It's really emergent. And we also see a progressive shift from vocalization that are principally driven by internally generated goals. And basically, it's all the same in all agents, to a period where they begin to imitate the sounds in their social environment. And that's also a transition that we observe in human children. And finally, we've been also observing, if we run those models many times with exactly the same parameters, we observe that there is actually a lot of diversity and still some regularities. So there are some developmental paths that have some structure that come very often, and there are also some individual developmental paths that are very different. And so this duality between diversity and regularity is also something that we've been observing in child vocal development, and that's fully self-organized here in this system. We've been also studying and showing similar kinds of results, for example, in modeling the organization of the development of tool use. And more recently, we've actually more directly tested the learning progress hypothesis by designing experiments for humans. So basically, what we've been doing is that in the lab, we've designed an experimental setup where we propose to human subject a set of learning tasks. And those learning tasks are, for example, classification tasks. So, for example, you have several monster families, and in each monster families, like, for example, this kind of monster, members differ by their size or by their shape. And in each member family, they have a food preference that depends basically on their shape, on their shape and their size and their features. And people, they need to learn to predict what to prefer to eat based on those visual features. And so there are some families which are very easy to learn, some other that are a little bit more complicated or even very complicated. And then there is one family, and we don't tell that to human people, that's impossible to learn. Like basically their food preferences are random. And so basically we tell to human subject, you're free to explore those learning activities for a while, and we don't give them any indication, any objective. And then we have a control group to which we actually give an indication. We are going to tell them at the end, we will test them, we will test you on those learning families, and we want you to maximize the test. So it's basically we give them the objective of maximizing learning. And so basically, a first observation that we've made is that the free exploration group, actually a significant part of it behaves like the group to which we give the objective of maximizing learning. Some of the parts of the free exploration group is more lazy, but still there is a part that's spontaneously adopting this maximizing learning objective. And actually, quantitatively, we've actually tried to explain the data by considering a space of utility function, like motivation function that subject might use, which has several components, a component that's measuring the percentage of errors, and another component that's measuring the learning progress. And so they can be combined, those components, with different weights that enables to basically cover a large space of possible motivational systems. And basically, to make it short, what we could show is that the models of utility function that explain best the behavior of humans in the free exploration case are utility function that take into account the learning progress. So that was basically the first experimental confirmation that the human brain might actually use learning progress as a tool to organize spontaneous exploration of learning activities. Okay, let me quickly talk about applications. Again, I mean, just in the interest of time, I won't go into the detail, but to give you a general overview. So first of all, we've seen in those experiments that those mechanisms for intrinsically motivated learning, they allow to generate automatically a learning curriculum. And they are general enough such that they don't make too many hypotheses about the underlying learning systems. And because also they were made to model child development, it was a natural idea to say, okay, maybe we could apply those mechanisms to help children learn better, for example, by using those mechanisms to adaptively personalize the learning curriculum in educational technologies. So for example, in the domain of mathematics, we've made experiments in primary schools where the idea was to propose exercises that maximize the learning progress of a given child in order to maximize both the learning efficiency and the motivation. And because children, you need to not waste their time, you need to start fast the inference, we helped a little bit the system by defining a graph of activity that was basically exploiting some knowledge from experts in the pedagogy of mathematics. That's basically a space of exercises with some parameters. And basically the way they are parameterized comes from knowledge of mathematics. And there are a few constraints of what kind of path is allowed and not allowed in this graph that is given by the experts. But then, given that graph, the algorithm decides how to move in that space of exercises. So initially, it begins by a subset of easy exercises of different kinds. Inside this subset, it estimates which one produce maximal learning progress, and it proposes to the children those exercises. And then there is a mechanisms for identifying kinds of exercises that becomes completely mastered and it gets out of the zone of proximal development and opening new kinds of exercise. And so progressively, the zone of active exercises is moving across the graph, progressively personalizing the sequence. And so we use various measures at relatively large scale. Like initially, we did an experiment with more than 1,000 children. And we show that compared to a pedagogical sequence that made by hand by a pedagogical expert, not only we can reach higher learning efficiency in terms of results that the system gets. And this is due to the fact that pedagogical experts in general, they target kind of the medium student, but what they do is not so well for students that are either with difficulties or that have facilities. And so both of them gets frustrated. And also in terms of motivation, we could show that the personalization gets children more motivated than their hand-defined sequence. And more recently, actually, this system was being transferred into a larger system that's built by educational technology companies, and that's a project that's supported by the Ministry of Education. So we're pretty happy to have this kind of impact in the real world of such work. So another kind of application that we've considered of those autotelic learning systems is that, okay, remember that they are enabling to model the way children explore the world as little scientists. Children are amazing little scientists in a way. Could we use some of those models and so some of these techniques to help actually also adult scientists to make discoveries? In some domains, like domains where there is a lot of complexity, complex systems like high-dimensional systems with many parameters and a very complicated nonlinear dynamics, it's not always very easy to understand just by math what's the space of possible behaviors, how to map those behaviors, and how to optimize some of those behaviors. And sometimes, actually, for a number of systems, scientists, physicists, or chemists, they don't even have a mathematical model to work with. And so one question is, can we use this kind of automated exploration tools to help the scientists? And so this is actually what we've been doing with a number of years. So here is the work of one of our previous PhD students, Jonathan Grézu, who went in the lab of Likrona, chemistry lab, to apply some of those algorithms to explore self-organization of oil droplet systems. And in this lab, they study oil droplet system as a precursor for the origins of life. And it's basically when you mix certain oils in a certain chemical substrate, you observe very lifelike phenomena like the ones you're right now seeing in this video. But at this point in time, no one has a reasonable mathematical model of the chemistry and the physics underlying those oil droplets. So basically, researchers, they are still at the stage of really like, before this project, trying by the hand, okay, let's try these parameters, let's observe what we see in the microscope. And so that's very, very empirical, and it's very inefficient because there are many parameters and many ways they cannot really discover. And so one first step that they've taken is that they've built some robot to automatize experimentation to do many of them. And then the second steps they've been taken is that they've really used the exploration algorithm, the autotellic learning algorithm, to explore the space of possibilities in that space. And they were able to show pretty fast that by the goal exploration mechanism I described, they can actually discover, even along relatively simple features, new kind of phenomena that they could not explore either by random or systematic screening or by using their hand intuition. And recently, we've been actually wanting to explore further this assisted discovery by also considering other kinds of complex systems like cellular automata that's been used as theoretical models of the origins of life by many researchers. So many of you are familiar probably with the discrete game of life, which is a discrete cellular automata in which people basically observe that it's possible to self-organize little localized shapes like those gliders that might be at a very abstract level seen as kind of the origins of some form of little cells or little individuals. But it's been very, very difficult to understand actually how to build those little creatures so that they actually have some form of robustness, of sensory motor agency that we see in the real world. And basically people so far in the game of life, they've explored also, like in chemistry, mostly by the end or by brute force exploration of that space, and that both of them are pretty inefficient. So recently, we've come to see whether those methods of autotellic exploration could help to explore those spaces. And we've considered actually a slightly more complicated space, which is continuous cellular automata. There is one of them that's pretty interesting. That's called Lenya, that was made by a guy called Berchan. And basically, it's continuous version. So it's basically a field of continuous activations, and locally activations are updated by some kind of convolution kernels, basically a set of kernels that are taking into account in a continuous manner the local activation around to update the local activation. And so if you initialize various patches of those environments and you consider various random rules of physics to update this environment, you see many, many patterns emerging, but very few of them are actually localized patterns, things that you might say like look the first cells or the first behavior. Sometimes by exploring by the end, people have found localized targets like the one you see on the left. These are equivalents of the gliders in the game of life, but they are very fragile. Like these are basically localized wave patterns that move around, but basically when they collide with something, they just disappear, they explode. And so basically one open scientific question is it possible to find environment with laws of physics which enable self-organization of creatures, which is basically, so initially there is only an environment, only local physical rules. There is nobody, no sensors, no limbs, no muscles, whatever, just distributed local physics. Can we find an environment with laws of physics such that agents self-organize with a localized body that are robust, that can have organized reaction to their environment, that generalize to multiple kinds of environments, that can reproduce, that can coordinate? And so we've been basically using the general autotellic exploration approach I presented before to explore the space of environments, to explore the space of physical laws, and to see the kind of things that happen in those environments. And so we did that by step. First, we wanted to show whether we can self-organize creatures so localized patterns that move around in a robust manner. So we train basically and we explore the space, trying to see if we can get them localized and move around for a given amount of step. And we discovered that actually, if we let them move around longer, many of them are robust. We then explored how those self-organized localized patterns and move can continue to move and be robust to obstacles. So we generated many random obstacle environments and progressively actually found localized wave patterns that move around and are able to deal with obstacles. But those obstacles were in a given distribution of obstacles, and we wanted to test to what extent the self-organized wave patterns or creatures would be robust if we put them in other environments. And actually, we were happy to observe that there is a lot of robustness of those self-organized things. For example, here you see them move around in environments with properties that they did not, that were not considered during the exploration process and the learning process. Even like moving obstacles. So here we kind of dodge bullets to those kind of emergent creatures, and they are still very robust. And here we do experiments where, for example, at some point we, like on purpose, we erase part of the body, and automatically they regenerate their body, and they react and they turn in another direction. And so that's very interesting, because remember that, like, from a physical point of view, these are only wave patterns, just wave pattern. There is not a notion of a body, not a notion of a sensors, not a notion of the motors, and even less the notion of a brain. So here you have really, from physics, an emergent of a localized pattern that's, from the point of view of an external observer, has many of the fundamental properties of agency, sensory motor behavior, but without a well-defined difference between sensing, thinking, deciding, acting. It's all emergent from physics. So it's basically intelligence without a brain, only from physics. We actually also found emergent behavior, like the ability of those creatures to preserve their individuality. We put several of them in the same environments. When they meet, they still preserve their individuality. We also observe some forms of reproduction, like when they meet, they preserve their individuality, but also a new creature is created. So that might be the first steps to generate an open-ended evolutionary process, and other kinds of collective experiments. So that's really, like, here a way to illustrate the importance and the usefulness, on the one hand, of autotellic learning for exploring complex spaces, and also within that particular case, to understand also the role that physics can have in generating intelligent behavior, even if you don't have a brain. Okay, actually, there is a last part. I'm going to go very quick, just to keep within reasonable time. Just to explore the third fundamental idea I was mentioning, is that intelligence develops in a social environment. Okay, so as Jerome Brunner and many others have argued, if we look at humans, one of the key properties of humans is that they develop a relatively complex social intelligence, which is related to the social challenges they have to face during their life. And it's not only that humans develop social skills, is that, as Vygotsky and others have defining, is that social skills, and language in particular, at some point they become internalized to become cognitive tools. And also the social environment is a way to scaffold and to guide the learning. So there is a lot of different ways to see why social environment should be important. So first of all, for the first point, I'm going to be very quick, but just to emphasize that so far, most of machine learning and AI has basically ignored trying to develop intelligent social machines. Like, most of the work was, like in the first slide I presenting, whether it's about playing board games like AlphaGo, the game of Go, moving robots that build molecules. It's all fundamentally non-social. It can be very, very impressive, but it's non-social. Something that's very important is progressively to drive AI to try to model and understand how it's possible to acquire some of the keys in human social skills, for example, joint intentionality. How can one represent the state of minds of others, understand their goals, understand how to coordinate in a pragmatic social context to jointly achieve a goal, understand the norms and the morality of a given sociality. So this is a very, very open field, and we are only beginning to get steps into this. For example, with some colleagues, we are right now working on developing artificial environments where we are introducing social challenges and social peers, such that the learning agent needs to learn to solve tasks that involve various types of theory of mind skills, recursive inference, and this. But beyond learning those advanced social skills, I like also to make a few comments on the importance of social skills and language in particular as a cognitive tool. And this is what we could call Vygotskian AI, and if we're combining with autotellic AI, it's going to be Vygotskian autotellic artificial intelligence. So that's basically the idea that, okay, in large part also during the life, there are two kinds of learning processes. Basically, there is one learning process, which is the kind of I discussed before, like autotellic learning, autonomous learning, where agents generate their own goals and they try to learn by themselves to reach them. Another form of learning is learning by interacting with the social peers. And so, for example, it may happen in multiple ways. For example, when the robot is acting around, social peers may use language to describe what it is doing, and in such a way, the robot is going to, or the agent is going to align language with behavior trying to learn a mapping between the two. And for example, it might learn how to achieve a language command that's specified in language. The humans might also teach to the agents what's good and what's bad. So that's basically teaching reward functions. So for example, when the robot is doing things, humans might say like it's good or it's bad or it's corresponding well to this goal or not well to this other goal. So a lot of things that can be learned in interaction with social peers. And what's important is that at some point, the agent learning with the social peer can also not only extract the knowledge from the social peer, but make an internal model of the social peers, such that they could imagine later on when they are alone, if I wanted to learn this, how the social peer would guide me, would help me to do so. So it's like learning a little internal social peer, for example, that would say, okay, now if I do this, I could myself describe using language what it would be. I could myself decide whether it's going to be good or bad, what the social peer would have said to me. And this internalization is going to be key in multiple ways for solving problems, even when social peers are not there anymore. And one very important way for autotellic exploration is for generating abstract out of distribution goals. In all the kinds of autotellic learning I spoke about in the first part of my presentation, goals were relatively concrete, like concrete configurations of the world that the agent might try to reach. But if you look at humans, they are able to imagine many kinds of abstract goals. And one of the ways they can imagine abstract goals is actually by using language. And that's really an idea that Lev Vygotsky developed a lot. And so, like, to make a practical example, imagine that a child knows the word cat and knows the word bus, and he's going to say, okay, let's make a drawing as a game. What could I draw? Oh, what if I would combine the word cat and bus? Maybe what if I would try to draw a cat bus? And then right away it drives it to a task, for example, leading it to invent this drawing, which was actually made by the group of Miyazaki. And so we've actually explored this exact idea in an experiment where we have a deep reinforcement learning agent that's autotellic. But then in the first phase, it's actually like initially exploring autonomously this environment, but there is a social peer that's describing using language what he is doing, the simple discoveries he's making at the beginning. And those descriptions, they are going to be used in multiple ways. They are going to be used, for example, to align language and behavior for learning a policy, which basically given a language, what it could do. But more importantly, it's going to enable the agent to learn a model of the guidance of the social peers in its own head. So for example, given a language goal, a language descriptions, and a behavior, how the social peer would have scored a given behavior. Also, it can learn a captioner, which is, okay, I do this behavior. What language the social peer would have used to describe that behavior? And this can be used later on for hindsight learning. Like if the social peer is not there anymore, I can describe my own discoveries, use that language to characterize my discoveries and use that to learn. And of course, that's also a way language, I just explained, to imagine new goals, to recombine the words to imagine new goals. So basically, language is also a way to convey a model of relevance, of interestingness, a model of what's salient in the world from the perspective of the human. So we've tried this, and for example, the kind of thing that happens in the second phase, where the social peer is not there anymore, but the agent now can use its internal model of the social peer to imagine new goals. Maybe the social peer in the past talked about grasping red trees, grasping red algae, and growing blue algae. Now, if you recombine those words, you can imagine, okay, what if I could imagine the goal of growing a red tree in my environment. And so this is a new goal, and actually the agent can also reuse its learned goal achievement function, like deciding when growing a red tree is true or false, which is actually possible to do by using neural networks that are some modularity that are able to generalize across the meaning of sentences. And then it can use that internalized reward functions to guide learning of these new goals he is now considering and he is never considered before. And so by doing this, now the agent is going to be able to discover new abstract goals, new skills, even without the guidance of the social peer. and really using language as a tool to organize and abstract its knowledge and in exploration. So yeah, just curves, we've been measuring many ways it can be useful. But okay, let me just conclude and finalize this presentation. Okay, the three fundamental ideas were: one, the child is autotellic. It's generating its own goals, ordering them, and it's pretty fundamental for autonomous learning. And we are beginning to have machine approaches to build machines capable of autotellic learning. We've shown also that there are a number of interesting applications of this. We've seen also the importance of embodied behavior, the roles of physics in self-organizing aspects of intelligence. And finally, I've discussed first step towards taking into account the role of the social context, and in particular language as a cognitive tool to further organize autonomous exploration. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Pierre-Yves. That was very, very cool, very rich and broad. And it made me think about many things that are relevant for my field, which is cellular biology and evolution. So are there other questions from anybody here?
Your microphone, Robert, is off.
Bob, we don't hear you.
Yes. Okay, I have a question, and maybe this is naive. I wonder about the role in early autotelic learning of two physiological processes, namely kind of pruning and unpruning, so increasing the depth of the network, and then then also the notion of short versus long-term memory, namely two timescales of recording or responding to experiences. So I wonder about short and long-term memory and also pruning, unpruning.
Yeah. So the first part, pruning and pruning, that's a very important point. A number of people in the community, including us, have considered indeed the idea of not only progressively controlling the complexity of the problems or the goals, but also controlling the complexity of the learning machine itself. Exactly. One way to do that is indeed by, for example, progressively adding new modules, new neurons, and also potentially pruning some of them. There are several approaches that were considered. One of them is, for example, some kind of pre-programmed schedule of creating neurons or removing neurons. In practice, experiments we've been doing with this kind of approach show that it's pretty difficult with a manually done schedule to take advantage of this approach. But what we found is that we can also apply some forms of automatic curriculum learning on this, just like we can use the learning progress measure to decide when to shift to a more complicated goal or what kind of goal. We've used that also to decide how to shift to more complicated learning machines, and it's actually much better, much more efficient. And related to this, we've also considered a slight variant of what you propose, which is not to change the complexity of the neural network, but also to change the complexity of the body. So, for example, increase the temporal and spatial resolution of the motor system or the perceptual system. So, for example, the visual system might be very coarse at the beginning, and you might progressively increase the resolution. And the motor system, you might, for example, be only able to send very coarse motor commands every 100 milliseconds in the beginning, and progressively you increase the fine-grained resolution and the time resolution of the motor commands you send. And here again, we found that trying to find manually some kind of schedule of increasing the complexity makes it difficult to work better than starting from the full complexity. But adaptively controlling this complexity with some measures I presented can be very helpful. And the other question, okay.
Well, sort of two time scales of
So there are many things to say. One thing to say, I didn't really explain that, but there are actually several time scales playing in the autotelic learning architecture I presented. There is the short time scale of learning given a goal that is imagined and sampled by an organism. And in that time scale, it's really like, so you have, for example, a machine that's rolling out a behavior in the world, and it's collecting a lot of short time scale data, and it's trying, and there is a time scale for updating the behavior for that particular goal on that time scale. But then there is another time scale of learning, which is at the metacognitive level, which is learning to map the difficulty or the learnability of different kinds of activities. And this time scale to be, so this process to be efficient and useful needs to be on a relatively coarse and long-term time scales. So for example, if you try to estimate the derivative of your learning about a goal locally in time, for example, the kind of thing you might be doing with your fingers and an object, it might be very, very noisy. And so maybe not a very good signal for driving the exploration. It's rather when you take a step back and you look at the learning dynamics at a longer time scale that you might get a signal that's interesting to differentiate learning to stack cubes from learning to locomote from learning language for an aspect of language. So that's one aspect related to so basically longer time learning on longer time scales is a way to organize learning on the short time scales.
I see. So very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
But I have another question. Can you match what you observe, say, in development of a child with what you know about data about neural development in the brain, right? You know something, right? How brain changes and the brain has different pathways develop differently. Can you match these two things in some sense? To have some idea how the development reflected in the anatomy and physiology of the brain. We know little, but you know something, because I know a little, but some people know probably more about that.
Yeah. So we've not been focusing so much on trying to precisely model. As you say, we know little, but we know aspects of brain development. We've not so much actually focused on our side on modeling those low-level biological processes, except for the what I was saying for when my answer to Robert. In some previous projects, we modeled aspect of the progressive increase in the spatiotemporal resolution of the perceptual and motor system, which is related to myelination of the neural system. What people seem to understand for this is that actually for example, myelination is more or less deterministic and not so much adaptive. In our case, we found that in theory it's more efficient to be adaptive, but I would say I'm not fully sure to what extent it's clear to say that in it is really like predetermined and fixed. Maybe it's more adaptive what we believe. And from the perspective of the brain itself, so on our side, we've mostly focused on trying to match the developmental phases we observe from a behavioral and psychological point of view, in the sense that trying to map the sequences we observe in terms of development of skills and kinds of knowledge. But that's a different kind of match than the neurophysiological data. This is not something we've explored a lot. And one of the reasons maybe is that realistic neural models of the brain, they are very, very complicated. And here, to do the kind of experiments I show, we need to have to have them relatively fast. Like we need to have something that's compute efficient and relatively flexible to explore, for example, the different development trajectories in different bodies in different environments. So yes, we've taken a slightly different focus, but that's a fully relevant question to try to model and to see the impact.
No, I don't think about modeling, but getting overall principle of organization of the brain, and if this principle corresponds to the principle you pursue, right? Of course, details may be specific. We don't The question to describe in a way that will match what you observe, not in details, of course.
Yeah,
Of
yeah,
course,
yeah.
you
Okay.
don't try to
I see.
model the brain. It's an absurd idea to model the brain. So, for
Yeah, yeah.
example, you know the brain has different parts and they're organized quite differently, and serves particular function there, and which function corresponds to what, right? To get some guesses what happens.
Yeah, yeah.
It may give you suggestion what you do and what you miss, right?
Yeah. So
Because
no,
part of it
you're
is invisible, it doesn't go to the surface.
yeah, you're fully right. And so actually one interesting thing about that is the role of the dopaminergic circuits, like motivational neural circuits. For a long time, people were theoretically understanding dopaminergic circuits as basically a system where, okay, I'm going to be a little bit doing a caricature, but just to, I think it's not far from reality. It's the idea that dopamine was kind of encoding extrinsic rewards as modeled in reinforcement learning systems. And basically those dopaminergic signals, they were used as the reward signal to be optimized by the brain for learning. And for a long time, those dopaminergic signals, they were really thought as encoding either extrinsic rewards from the social environments or extrinsic but physiological rewards like level of sugar or internal physiological rewards. And when we began 15 years, more than 15 years ago, now really nearly 20 years ago, to work on those theoretical models of curiosity-driven learning, basically we made the hypothesis that, like actually proposed also by some psychologists, that in the brain there might be a system generating rewards, not because of physiological needs, but because there is detection of things like novelty, surprise, and even what I was saying, learning progress. And this was actually at the time where there were the first discoveries that the dopaminergic system was not only encoding for like physiological reward, but also signals like surprise. And since then, actually, there has been a lot of many development in neuroscience showing actually the multiple functionalities of dopamine, and actually the fact that it's really a system that can be activated even in context where there is no extrinsic reward at all, but just, for example, new information about a topic that leads not to reward. So, for example, there are neuroscience people working also in monkeys, in other forms of non-human animals, that even in monkeys discovered that there are some neurons, dopaminergic neurons, that fire even in cases where monkeys are given information that is only new information and that they know will not help them to get new sugar or new water or new extrinsic rewards. So before we were believing that the brain of monkeys would only generate reward when they get an information that they know they can use to get sugar or food. And now we know they also fire when they get information they know will not be helpful to get more reward. So just for the sake of information, their brain is reacting. So we have now this convergence between those theoretical models and this idea that the brain is really measuring information for itself and rewarding it for itself independently of
Wait, but what means information? Come on, what do you call information? Yeah.
Yes, that's a good point.
It's not any kind of signal, right? It's not structured in a way, right?
Yes, it is. It is basically what. So in my case, what I call information is basically a perceptual a percept that is transformed in an internal representation that contributes to predicting better what's going to happen in the future, whatever the value of this future, whether it's good news or bad news. If it's a representation that you acquire through interacting with the world that's enable you to predicting or to control better the future, in our case, this is what we call what we would call information.
But for that, you have to have a model of a future. So you have your brain model of the future, and then information makes sense.
It's not exactly. What we do is empirical evaluation of the usefulness of a new piece of info, of like a new percept. we empirically evaluate how much in practice it's going to improve our predictions in the future, but we don't need to already have a model of the future. We just can wait a little bit that in a certain area, we make a few experiments and we can, for example,
right?
Sorry?
You have to know still, you don't know the model, but you have possibilities, right?
Yes.
You have to know, right? And this is a tricky thing, yeah? You need some structure on which you match this, right? It's like food, yeah? You know, to have a food, it must have mechanism absorbing this food. The molecule must have certain shape and recognizable as a food or maybe poison, but not neutral.
Yes,
right?
yes, yes.
So the recognition mechanism of the significance of what you receive. And the mechanism must be prior to that. And in the case of a cell, it's already built into the cell, right?
Yeah, so basically you need that the brain is capable to formulate some hypothesis in a way and to consider multiple forms of prediction and basically test them through the interaction with the world. And it's going to prefer exploring and getting the data.
But let me give an example. You have some words in the language you know and the language you don't know. And formally the same kind of symbolic sequence, but one is for your information and others is not information, right? And so how to formulate that, right? If you have language, you can say it, but this is what information comes before language, right?
Yeah, well, in our case, basically the way it's approached is that initially there is no language in the sense that everything is just symbols without any meaning. And by discovering some symbols, the agent, like in the last part of the talk I presented, is going to try, for example, to okay, so let me actually give more precisely an example in that case. Okay, so here in that case, you have, so the agent is represented by this little hand around. What it is perceiving is basically numbers that characterize the position, the color, the shape of those objects. But these are just numbers. I mean, I say it's the color, but it doesn't know its color, it's just numbers. And another thing that this agent is perceiving is the symbols that are produced by the social peer, which is represented by this little head here. And so initially he does not know how to interpret those symbols. It's just, again, it's like a sequence of numbers. And so initially by behaving, he's going to discover that there are some of these numbers that are produced at the same time as certain behaviors. And so it can, as a start, make a model of when a sequence of symbols is associated to a certain behavior that is observing. And then from this, basically, he can begin to imagine a goal that could be, okay, now what I'd like to consider this sequence of symbols as a goal. And what does it mean? It means that he'd like to find a behavior such that at the end of the behavior, the social peer, which is an object like the other, is going to produce that list of symbols. So in a way, he learns to produce a behavior that's going to predictably get the other guide produce that list of symbols. And that's the way he's going to ground and learn the meaning of those symbols. So those symbols will represent for him, he will learn to use the symbol as a way to represent an outcome in the world that's controllable and predictable. And so in the end, he's going to have really a grounded meaning of those symbols. But initially, there was no meaning. So it's really empirical in a way. That's empirical that he discovers that some list of symbols are associated to some elements of behaviors. It can use those symbols to define, to characterize the states, but also to define a problem you might want to reach. And initially, when he sets a goal as language, he basically, the way to know whether he's right or not is that he's relying on the feedback from the social peer, from the human, who will also give the description at the end. But as he is observing the social peer giving the feedback, he can also learn a model of the social peer, which is basically how the social peer is producing a certain sequence of symbols given a certain behavior. and he can internalize this this captioning system, which you can view as an internationalization of the reward system, such that later on, when he imagines a new list of symbols as a goal, it tries some behaviors trying to reach it, and to score its own behavior, it will use its internal model of the social peer. Basically, okay, in this situation, what kind of sequence of symbol the social peer would have said, and if it matches the goal it decided, then it decides it's a success. So it's really empirical, the way it learns to ground the meaning of the signals. So I don't know if it answers your question. It's in this second part that then they reuse the goals, the list of symbols to generate goals and to self-score their behavior. And so in practice here, I use, to make it understandable by humans, we use like words like grasp and red tree, just that enables us to interpret what's happening. But for the system, it's just a list of numbers. And what's interesting is that by using some certain kind of architectures for neural networks with some form of modularity, when, for example, an agent has learned to say when a trajectory, a behavioral trajectory corresponds to grass red tree, when it corresponds to grass red algae, and when it corresponds to grow blue algae. It is maybe he's learned that by examples provided by the social peer. Now he can generalize alone to guess when a trajectory is corresponding to a new combination of those symbols. So now there are many neural network techniques that enable this form of generalization.
So you might give a reference to one of your papers. Probably there are more, yeah?
Yeah.
But we can learn more.
Yeah, I would say if you want to understand a little bit more this idea, this paper is the one to start with.
Are there more questions? So if not, I would thank Pierre-Yves and give him a round of applause, even if virtual. And Bob, can I ask you to say 2 words about LSC? Bob, you're muted.
Sure. So this is the inaugural event for what we hope will be a long-running series of symposia. Misha and I have both had the experience of trying to run conferences in merging biology and mathematics. Merging is too strong a word. Mixing in some way math and biology. And the difficulty is getting the mathematicians to participate in a meaningful way. So the new concept here is threefold. First of all, luminaries such as Pierre-Yves helping to organize the next year's events and giving webinars on topics of interest. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is, and this is where sort of the mathematical part plays a role, is having an event at IHES, an informal event at IHES, gathering these experts and gathering the speakers for that particular year to interact informally and directly with the community here. So the mornings through lunch are spent at IHES with this group of people and informal interactions. And then the third component is a series of lectures, public lectures in Paris. Again, I think Misha and I both had the experience that people won't commute to the suburbs to have events in Paris that we hope will be well attended. And I guess I sort of misspoke at the beginning. The very first aspect, this was sort of Misha's initial input to this idea, is that there's a race between biology and artificial intelligence to transform the world in which we live, and it's gonna be neck and neck, a year at a time, and that's the C in LSC is cognition. So it's life, structure, cognition. Life is biology, structure is mathematics, kind of in the middle, which should be part of these ongoing developments, and then cognition, artificial intelligence. And Pierre-Yves, thank you. It was a marvelous inaugural lecture for what we hope will be a long-running.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here with you today.
Great.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye,
Ciao.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.